Hello, my name is Aaron Hathaway. I'm a technical services manager with Nufarm. Today we're going to talk about a new PGR called Anuew from Nufarm, and we're going to talk about its use specifically in cool season golf turf. So let's get started. I want to talk briefly about the difference between Class A and Class B PGRs. The four different plant growth regulators that I have listed here certainly are not all of the PGRs that are available to you. In fact, there's many mixes also that you can buy, but we're going to talk about these four in particular. Trimit and Cutlass, or paclobutrazol and fipronil, are obviously Class B PGRs, and they inhibit GA, or gibberellic acid, early in the biosynthesis pathway. And you can see on the lower left, I kind of have a picture of that biosynthesis pathway. And you can see that it's these Class B PGRs inhibiting that synthesis right here. It's earlier in that pathway, so certain GA precursors just simply aren't being produced in that plant, and those GA precursors may be used in other pathways. And so because of that, Class B PGRs can be a little more aggressive. Class A PGRs, on the other hand, they're inhibiting GA much later in the biosynthesis pathway. So they're inhibiting that precursor from moving into that GA1, which is a plant active form and really is the main GA precursor for that cell elongation. So there are some differences between these two classes. Again, Class B can be more aggressive. There's differences between their use in different species as well. And Class B PGRs are a little more differential between species. If you look on the right side, you see some of the benefits from using PGRs, and you can certainly see problems if you're using PGRs too often and you start to get that stacking effect where you're just really, essentially, you're reducing the growth of the plant too much. So if there's any injury, plants are constantly senescing and drying out, and that those plants are always replacing those leaves with new leaves. So if you reduce growth too much, you can see too much suppression. But the goal is always to reduce the growth of the plant and really get these benefits that come as a result of that reduced growth. And the benefits like obviously reduced clippings, maybe you're going to dump less often if you're mowing your greens. Reduced maybe windrows on fairways, so you don't have to go out with a buffalo blower and blow those clippings and disperse them as often as you may have to if you weren't applying a PGR, especially in the spring when you might be baling hay. You can get things like plant health effects too, like increased tillering, increased color. And the idea is that you're not just shutting down the growth and losing all the sugars that plant is producing. You're actually partitioning the use of those sugars. Instead of that plant using them to produce vertical growth that we're just going to come along, mow off, and discard, the idea is to partition the use of those carbohydrates elsewhere, to new tillers, to more roots, which really help plants get through stress periods, help plants increase in quality, increase that aesthetic value, all of that stuff. And so we've known this for a while. We've been using PGRs often in low light conditions for more than just turf grass and other situations where we just don't want excessive growth. So I'm going to do a lot of comparison between Anuew and Trinexpac-ethyl since they're both very similar molecules. They're both Class A PGRs. One thing I didn't mention when I was comparing Class A and Class B is that Class B PGRs like Trimit, Cutlass, they are root absorbed. So it's necessary to water these materials in. Class A PGRs like Anuew and Trinexpac-ethyl, on the other hand, they're absorbed by the foliage of the plant, so it's not necessary to water them in, but it is necessary to have even good coverage of these plants, of these plant leaves, so that all the plants are able to take up a similar amount of PGR. And so do not irrigate, do not water these Class A PGRs in, don't water Anuew in. It's rain fast between 1 and 4 hours. It's a good idea. We always recommend applying it with a non-ionic surfactant just to improve the coverage of this material over those small plants, especially in a putting green setting. And then another important thing to mention is that if your carrier is water that has a lot of calcium, if you're dealing with hard water, it is important with Anuew to add ammonium sulfate to that tank at 1 pound of AMS for every pound of Anuew in the spray tank. So in summary, we're going to talk about use of Anuew and kind of compare it again to Trinex Pec Ethyl in bent grass. We're going to talk about the intensity of that regulation. We're going to talk about the duration of that regulation, or really we're going to talk about how often you need to make these applications. When is that reapplication necessary so that you're not hitting that rebound effect on fairways and greens. We're going to talk about the fact that Anuew gives you longer regulation, as the data has shown us over and over and over again. You can get longer regulation from Anuew, so we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about the increase in turf quality that you can realize from using these PGRs as well. So one similarity between Anuew and Trinex Pec Ethyl is growth regulation, the intensity of that growth regulation in particular. And so we can see here these light green bars are the control. So as we would expect, this is clipping yield, this is grams per plot, and really they're just treating these plots with a PGR or nothing at all if it's the untreated control, and then they're mowing a strip down these plots, collecting those clippings, drying them, and then weighing them, and then we get to compare them. And so as we would expect, the control is producing fewer clippings really than all of these treatments. And the thing I want to point out here is that that low rate of Anuew, 4 ounces per acre, which is very typical, is very similar to the low rate of Primo Max that we see here on this putting green as far as growth regulation. The higher rates are similar as well. But also we are just seeing great growth regulation, which is the main goal, again, so that we're getting the plant health benefits and we're getting the savings in labor and we're using less water. We really want to see this reduction in growth, which you're seeing with both PGRs. And superintendents, they've begun to kind of even monitor growth on putting greens themselves. They're starting to collect and maybe put it in a bucket and measure the volume of these clippings so that they can have some idea of how some of their putting greens may be different, or if their PGR is working or isn't, and so they know what to expect. And so that's something I always ask superintendents to do. When they call me and they say, hey, my PGR is not working anymore, I doubled the rate, it's still not working, I ask them, how do you know? Are you measuring these clippings that you're producing? If not, do it. And you can even go as far as treating half of, maybe it's a nursery green, treat half of your nursery green and look at both sides of that nursery green so that you're sure that what you think is happening is actually happening. And so as superintendents begin to do this, it becomes easier for them to really see the benefits of these PGRs, and you can see people are even tweeting some of the cool benefits they see from Anuew. So the summary of how these PGRs are working, not just Class A, but Class B, right here on bent grass fairways. And really I want to focus on the top two, which are the Class A, Anuew and Primo Max. You can see that the growth suppression is really similar. That range is very, very similar. The max is only 5% difference. And then the ideal reapplication every 350 to 380 growing degree days does not change between these two PGRs for fairways. So on fairways that are 100% bent grass, these PGRs, they're going to do a great job, and there's not really too much different between them, except for a few things that I'm going to mention later that are important. On greens, on the other hand, there is a big difference that I want to mention here, and I'm going to mention later in this webinar why that would matter to you. So for Trinex Pec Ethyl, the growth suppression, again, 20% growth suppression, and prohexadione calcium, which is Anuew, 25% growth suppression. So a little bit better or more intense growth suppression from Anuew, but it's this reapplication that I want to really look at. And so you're getting longer duration of growth regulation from Anuew than you are from Primo Max. You're getting about 50 more growing degree days, which translates on average into about 2 extra days, depending on what season you're in or what the air temperatures are. And so that may not seem like much, but I'm going to talk about why that would matter to you later in this webinar. As we look at growth regulation on greens, I want to first mention that, again, the untreated plots are producing more clippings than these PGRs, so the PGRs are doing their job for the most part. And this light green bar on the left side are clippings taken from June 19th in 2014 on this putting green. This is bentgrass putting green at Michigan State University. And so this was 13 days after these PGRs were applied. And again, we have a high and a low rate of Anuew and a high and a low rate of Primo Max. And so if these bars have the same letter, these light green bars have the same letter, they're not statistically different from each other as far as clipping production. And so you can see that the low rate of Anuew, very similar to the low rate of Primo Max, and the high rate of Anuew, similar to the high rate of Primo Max, but everything is different from the untreated, so we're getting what we wanted from this application. If we move to look at this next date though, this is July 3rd, temperatures are increasing, which means probably these PGRs aren't lasting quite as long as the plant because they're metabolizing them at a faster rate. We see that 4 ounces of Anuew is giving us statistically better regulation than 6 ounces of Primo, and the 8 ounces of Anuew is giving us statistically better regulation than the 12 ounces of Primo. And this is significant because it's exactly what I was telling you, that those 2 extra days perhaps. This July 3rd rating or clipping collection was 14 days after the last application. So it's very possible that that Primo Max is simply running out of juice and it's not regulating the turf like it once was, and it's about ready to hit that rebound. In fact, you can see the low rate of Primo Max is no different than the untreated statistically at this point. And Anuew is still giving us regulation. And so this is where those 2 extra days or those 50 extra growing degree days, whatever that looks like as far as calendar amount, number of days, is really helpful, because our goal is to never hit that rebound because we're really going backwards. We're getting more clippings than if we never applied the PGR in the first place. More clippings than the untreated while we're in that rebound phase. And that means we're maybe using more water, we're causing that plant to use more sugars for that vertical growth that we couldn't care less about. And so this is where Anuew really shines on these bentgrass putting greens and really all cool season species mowed at this height, because it's going to give us a little bit extra time to make our applications as we see fit. If you're on a 14-day schedule to apply these PGRs, Anuew is going to give you a little bit more time to get out there and regulate turf again. And then as we move on to quality and just the overall appearance of this turf, again, we have a low and a high rate of Anuew and a low and a high rate of Primo Max, and we have visual turf quality, so higher bar is better quality. And you can see the thing I want to kind of point out right here, this is the high rate of Anuew, and even that high rate of Primo Max. Once we get into these high heat periods or the summer, when these plants really start to get stressed out, the applications can really pay off at this point. And so early on, you see that these PGRs decreased quality a little bit because we're not getting maybe as much growth as we needed to match the quality of that untreated plot. But once we get into the summer stress period, these applications really pay off because we've strengthened the plant over these other applications, where we've partitioned those carbohydrates to other things, whether it be roots or tillers, whatever it may be. And this is something we often see where we get to a point in the stress period of the season where we can see the differences. And here is Anuew on the right, so a little darker green color, which is the most common kind of benefit that we see because we have increased chlorophyll, and it's untreated on the left. Here's another plot. There was a 4x8 foot plywood board above that dashed line, and below the dashed line, no board. So below was treated with Anuew, above was not. There's a lot of Anuew bluegrass in this Oregon fairway, and so it's nice to be able to get that even appearance, that even quality appearance or even color appearance when you have a lot of Anuew bluegrass in there, which really stands out from really any other species that you might have on your golf course. So what about other cool season turf? Another awesome difference between Anuew and Trinexpec Ethyl is that you're going to get much more even regulation of mixed stands of cool season turf, especially when you have POA and bent. Anuew is much better at evenly regulating those two species together. So you're not going to get Anuew bluegrass dominating that stand when bent grass is still being regulated. You're getting much more even regulation. And we see that as we look at the length or duration of regulation on Anuew bluegrass in particular. It's much longer as far as a GDD model. And so we also see that with other cool season species as well. Ryegrass is another one where we get really great regulation of ryegrass. And we can see these typical application rates. When you have 100% Anuew bluegrass green or fairway, you're probably going to start off with a little bit lower rate just because that regulation is a little more intense on this particular species. When you get to creep and bent grass, you can up those rates a little bit, and when you have a mixed stand, it's really going to depend on what species is dominating that stand. If it's Anuew bluegrass dominated, I would start at that lower rate, and you can increase as you see fit, and then you can see the duration. Really, those are reapplication intervals. So on fairways, you reapply every 350 to 380 growing degree days, and on greens, because there's more growth potential on greens, you're going to reapply sooner. And here's ryegrass fairway in California. You can see that 8 ounces of Anuew down the middle, giving you the darker green color than the control on the right. This was multiple apps on this ryegrass fairway. I think it was every 14 days. There happened to be the superintendent's normal schedule of Primo to the left. But you see that color difference between Anuew and the control, and really that's an increase in chlorophyll. Again, allowing that plant to maybe increase its photosynthesis and increase its health through that avenue. And then this one says less power and overseeded turf. It doesn't matter if you're in the transition zone overseeding ryegrass, or if you're overseeding a fairway that got thinned out for whatever reason. Maybe it was snow mold or dollar spot thinned out your fairway, or heat stress thinned out your fairway. These Class A PGRs are really helpful for overseeded turf because they're absorbed by the foliage. So if you have a bunch of Anuew bluegrass that came in to again, any turf setting, then you can use something like Anuew, apply it to that turf, really regulate that growth, and then interseed right into it or overseed into that turf. And that foliarly absorbed PGR, that Class A PGR, something like Anuew, isn't going to affect those seedlings as long as you seed after you applied, or as long as they germinate after you applied, because it's absorbed by the foliage. And so it's a really nice way to use PGRs to suppress the growth of the turf that you're interseeding or overseeding into. And then after your ryegrass or whatever you've overseeded gets going, then you can again start using that PGR to increase the health of the turf species that you overseeded. And in this picture, you can see on the outside of these plots, so we had different rates of Anuew. On the left, in the middle a little bit lower, and on the right 7 ounces of Anuew. And then outside of these plots, you see way more Anuew bluegrass that came into this area. And so on this golf course, they were able to even limit or regulate the growth of that Anuew bluegrass so it didn't become a bigger part of the stand than it had to be. So what are some of the similarities between these two PGRs? The degree of growth suppression on creep and bent grass, greens, and fairways. You're going to get a little bit more intense suppression on putting greens, on bent grass putting greens with Anuew than you would Trinexpec Ethyl. But on fairways, the reapplication interval is pretty much the same. It's that 350 to 380 growing degree days. That window is really when you're going to apply or reapply these PGRs. So that's the same on fairways. The degree of turf grass quality enhancement is going to be about the same with these two PGRs. Unless you're dealing with a mixed stand where Anuew bluegrass starts to take over that stand. That could affect the quality of that stand overall for sure. And then the key differences is really longevity, which I talked about on bent grass putting greens. And that includes bent grass putting greens that have Anuew bluegrass at least as a part of that stand that could be a big part of that stand. But you're going to get 50 more growing degree days from Anuew, which again averages out to about 2 more days, but that could make a big difference, as I mentioned before, as you're really working to avoid hitting that rebound effect. More even suppression of bentgrass, Anuew bluegrass, ryegrass, anytime these species are in a mixed stand. If you have a PGR like Trinexpec that doesn't affect Anuew bluegrass in the same way that it does bentgrass, it's not only going to become a quality issue perhaps, or you're going to be mowing more of those Anuew bluegrass portions, but still maybe less of the bentgrass. But over time, you could start, it could be a benefit to that Anuew bluegrass, which could become a bigger and bigger part of that stand. So Anuew is a really nice product for more even regulation of these cool season species. And in fact, you're even going to, as Anuew bluegrass becomes a bigger part of that stand, maybe even reduce your rate a little bit, because it is going to affect Anuew bluegrass pretty intensively. So it's that increased longevity on Anuew bluegrass as well. It's going to last longer on Anuew bluegrass than Trinexpec ethyl, which means you can kind of regulate Anuew bluegrass from becoming a bigger and bigger part of that stand, which almost everybody's interested in. And then ryegrass, we talked about overseeding. Anuew can be really nice. That foliar absorbed product can be used in very specific ways to limit the growth of the stand that you're applying into, whether it's Bermuda grass and you're overseeding with ryegrass, and then start regulating ryegrass as it becomes a part of that stand. The last thing I want to mention is that Anuew provides effects faster than Trinexpec ethyl. So the reason that matters is if you have hit that rebound effect, then you want to stop that growth as quickly as possible. And Anuew, it's been found, can halt growth. That effect that you get, that growth regulation effect, can be put into place faster with Anuew than Trinexpec ethyl. So this is kind of a summary of all the rates, typical rates, and duration of control and intensity of control on greens versus fairways on all these different species that we've found to date. And it shows that we still have some work to do. We are still looking into exactly how long Anuew is lasting on all these different species and how it works differentially on all these, especially warm season species. So we're still doing a lot of research, but we're confident of how Anuew can be used, especially in cool season stands and also warm season, but for our purposes here in warm season stands, to evenly regulate turf and to give you a little bit longer duration on cool season turf on putting greens, so that you can manage your PGR applications a little bit better. So that's all we have for you. Thanks for listening. We want to let you know that you can always contact us. So there's my email, there's my phone number. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.